Dana Richards is a professor of computer science in the Vogenow School of Engineering at George Mason University. His PhD is from the University of Illinois at Urbana. I'd like to describe his research interests, but I don't understand them. They're too complex. Dana was the longtime friend and bibliographer of Martin Gardner, who is a polymath and public expert. Many of you might know of his the annotated Alice in Wonderland, and he was also columnist in the Scientific American, and so many other talents and things that it would take too long to describe. And I understand that Dana is now working on a biography. I've known Dana for many years through meetings at Sherlockian events. His interest and research in Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes is something I do understand, and it is extreme, it is extensive. His first Sherlockian publication was as a graduate student in 1979. He's published in the Baker Street Journal, Canadian Holmes, Sherlock Holmes Journal, Baker Street Miscellanea. I now have to add the Magic Door, and numerous other places. He's a member of many Sherlockian societies, and he was inducted into the Baker Street Irregulars with the title of the Priory School. He was the editor of My Scientific Methods, Science in the Sherlockian Canon, published in 2022 by the Baker Street Irregulars. His topic today is The Fires of Fate, a morality play that is bad medicine. And that is my great pleasure to welcome Dana Richards.
Talk will be rather short of the old. Okay. Oh, we're up. Okay, cool. Just a short preamble. I started on this talk in 2003 when I discovered that The Fires of Fate, the play The Fires of Fate, addressed.
Can you use the microphone?
Oh, these were just preambles. All right. Doesn't matter. Okay. So the point here is that The Fires of Fate mentions sclerosis, and my wife has multiple sclerosis. So obviously I needed to know more about this, and I started spending 20 years tracking all of this stuff down. So that's where all of this got started. All right. So I will, to the extent possible, read my paper to you because I believe that's the tradition, but I will extemporize as well. When Arthur Conan Doyle transferred his novel, The Tragedy of Korosko, to the stage, he introduced a major medical crisis. The play, Fires of Fate, had the lead character afflicted with posterior spinal sclerosis, and his handling of this crisis is a major thread in the revised plot. Doyle naturally made frequent use of his medical background in his fiction. Alvin Rodin and Jack Key explored this rich vein in a series of articles, their efforts culminating in a definitive book, The Medical Casebook of Dr. Arthur Conan Doyle. However, this crucial aspect of Fires is not mentioned by Rodin and Key. One of these buttons works, I'm sure. That one there. Thank you very much. This talk will follow three threads. So there's not going to be a single culmination. I'm going to be following three threads through this talk. First is the state of the art of Victorian medicine on the subject of sclerosis. Second is Doyle's view on sclerosis as seen in his writings over the years. And then we need to discuss The Fires of Fate because it is unpublished, and I cannot assume you have any knowledge of it. I apologize. Here we go. What is posterior spinal sclerosis? It is referred to by several names, so it is confusing when referring to the medical literature as well as the stories. It is commonly referred to as tabes dorsalis, and it is also known as locomotor ataxia. Tabes means decay. Here, that is a decay of the nerve cells. Dorsalis and posterior both refer to the position of the spinal column involved. Sclerosis just means hardening, so it is distantly related to arterial sclerosis. The sclerosis, often called lesions in the literature, is a reaction to the tabes. Ataxia is a loss of coordination, so locomotor ataxia is actually a symptom of the disease rather than the disease itself. It was called locomotor ataxia by the French in the early 1800s, and that's the reason for the confusion. Today, these historical terms, as well as the more modern tabetic neurosyphilis, is found in the literature. There were related diseases that had overlapping symptoms, such as lateral sclerosis and disseminated sclerosis. It was a struggle for Victorian practitioners to keep them straight, and misdiagnoses slowed the understanding of the disease. In fact, an autopsy was necessary for a clear diagnosis. You don't expected to read that, you're just expected to be confused by it. All right, now, it was widely understood that the primary cause was syphilis. ACD clearly indicated the, quote, syphilitic poison. The cause of the disease and how it was related to syphilis was not understood then or now. Syphilis could have a long course and typically did not manifest itself as sclerosis, but when it did, everybody knew that it arose from immoral conduct, even if it was not spoken of. The general condition could spread to the optic nerve and to the brain, causing ataxia and dementia, a type of dementia called general paralysis of the insane. Syphilis was rampant in the 19th century all around the world. As a result, tabes dorsalis was fairly common, and you would probably know someone who had it. It was deadly, with death in 1 to 5 years. Because of penicillin, the disease is rare today. Other forms of sclerosis are still around, of course, like MS, but these are not so deadly anymore because of drugs that slow the progression of the disease. Now, Doyle wrote a story about syphilis called The Third Generation, and it's in his collection of stories around the red lamp. It involves a Dr. Horace Selby with a European reputation who diagnoses a patient who, like his father and grandfather, has syphilis. Syphilis is not hereditary. Now, as an aside, it can be congenital, which means that it would be passed from the mother through the placenta to the child. But it's not hereditary, and it's not a scourge on further generations. There is a reference to a related disease in a short story called A Medical Document. All right. Quote, well, take the complaint that kills many thousands every year, like GP, for example. The British public will have to know what GP is. It's increasing by leaps and bounds and has the distinction of being absolutely incurable. General paralysis is its full title. Okay, that was in the story, The Medical Document. And we see, of course, here that general paralysis of the insane is linked in the literature with tabes dorsalis. Okay, so it's not tabes dorsalis, but it's all circling around that same thing. Now, there was an offhand reference to sclerosis in the short story Crabbe's Practice, but we're not going to discuss that. What we are going to discuss is these works by Arthur Conan Doyle, one at a time. Now, the first one is his thesis. Now, some of you probably know this, if you know anything about his thesis, is that it was on sclerosis. Now, the thesis is reported in detail by Rodin and Key, so we know a lot about it, even though it is unpublished today and is only handwritten. If you're like me, you go to the University of Edinburgh and they give you microfilm. That's how I got it. All right, so in there, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Quote, in the preparation of a thesis upon a subject, the postmortem room and the microscope are of more value than the writing desk and the library. A workman must, however, work with the tools as he finds at hand, and this I have endeavored to do to the best of my ability. What he's saying is that he did nothing except read books. Just to be clear about that. The thesis involved very few new ideas, and it contained a good but incomplete survey of the literature, starting with a lengthy discussion of neurological pathways in general and the pathology of the disease from other people's postmortems, i.e. where the lesions would be found. I want to say, though, the jargon is impressive. It's not like they were, you would think from the jargon, this was a thing written yesterday. Okay, they really had names for every nerve in the body. All right, ACD gave a thorough discussion of the symptoms, from a drooping eyelid or blurred vision, then numbness alternating with prickliness, and a decrease in sexual desire. Later, there was an uncertain gait, loss of knee-jerk reflex, and a loss of balance. Now, Doyle had picked up on the suggestion that the etiology was due to poor circulation within the blood supply to the spine. Walter Moxon had proposed a vasospasm theory for the promotion of the lesions. This led Doyle to the theory that treatment with a vasodilator would reduce the symptoms. He suggested using a nitroglycerin mixture known as Merrill's solution, and out of curiosity, he took massive doses of it himself. Now, just I guess to make sure it's not poisonous, I don't know why else he would have done that. Other therapies at the time included silver nitrate, bromides, arsenic, mercury, ergot, morphine, hydrotherapy, and galvanism. Doyle's prescription probably would be less effective, would be equally effective to these and probably less harmful. There were essentially no clinical trials in his thesis. He had one patient, but he moved away after a couple weeks. Now, for us, the most interesting parts of the thesis, to me at least, is when ACD refers to his own reasoning techniques. Quote, changes which we have been endeavoring to establish by reasoning and deduction. Quote, if, however, we can prove this vascular effect, I think that our surmise becomes almost a certainty. Quote, the fourfold corroboration of the view appears to me to be as conclusive as scientific circumstantial evidence can ever be. Quote, yet it shows how reliable an inductive method of reasoning such as there may be possible. Quote, a young practitioner is liable to fall victim to post hoc propter hoc fallacies. So I was really fascinated by the fact that he was very much aware of logical thinking in respect to science. Very, very aware. Was that up before? Well, that's just what I said. Okay, now we're going to do some stories from around the red lamp. I tried to fix the order here, but I guess I didn't. Oh, now I know what this was. I put this slide here because I just wanted to give you an indication of the kind of literature that he was reading. Okay, his whole thesis was based on reading, and I have myself collected about 40 of these articles. Okay, and they're everywhere in the literature because everybody cared about this disease. Okay, and there's lots and lots of debate in the literature about the disease. And so he had a hard time making sense of all of that, of course. Around the red lamp. The Doctors of Hoyland. Whoops, today. This 1894 story from the collection Around the Red Lamp, I should point out Around the Red Lamp means doctor stories. The Doctor's Red Lamp is an indication of the profession. And so this simply means stories about doctors. It has an encounter between Dr. James Ripley and the encroaching Dr. Verinder Smith. Ripley was not only surprised to find that Smith is a woman, which is the subject of some other essay somebody might want to write, He is disconcerted by her superior knowledge. As it turns out, Smith has just read Ripley's paper in the Lancet on locomotor ataxia. But the views which you attribute to Professor Pitres of Bordeaux have been repudiated by Pitres. Apparently, a 1891 pamphlet contradicted the 1890 pamphlet. And, quote, it knocked the bottom out of Ripley's thesis. All right? Edwards, the biographer, felt that Doyle's thesis fundamentally depended on a pamphlet of Pitres. Rodin and Key think it's not so clear, but in any event, could it be that ACD is commenting here on some feedback that he received on his own thesis? It makes sense to me, at least. The Surgeon Talks. Another short story by Doyle. This story, which appears in the 1894 Round the Red Lamp, is a series of vignettes about Dr. James Walker, an expert himself on nervous diseases. Walker wrote a book on sclerosis. I'm sorry. While lecturing on the symptoms of locomotor ataxia, he demonstrated a test on himself, maintaining his balance with his heels closed and eyes closed. And he discovered that he had the symptoms. The diagnosis, prognosis, and course of the disease is in complete agreement with ACD's thesis. However, there is no hint of any treatment because, of course, there was no treatment. The cause was implicitly syphilis, and I think this is wonderful, just to indicate how well it was known by the public. The cause was implicit. Quote, Walker was a single man, which means that he was not restricted to a single woman. Okay, everybody knew he had syphilis at that point. It took 5 years to kill him, and he kept a careful record of his degeneration for science. It is not clear if the irony of the expert succumbing to his own disease is what was meant to be as a curiosity, or it is possible that it was a moralistic vignette. Walker's affliction followed moral lapses, but it gave him the strength to do good for another 5 years. Now we get to some Egyptian stories. So before we get to the Egyptian stories, we need some background. Now this background comes from a wonderful afterword by Dale Walker to the Gaslight edition of the Tragedy of Korosko. In the winter of 1895, ACD took his wife to Egypt for her tuberculosis and just perhaps a little adventure. Southern Egypt and Sudan had over the previous 15 years had a troubled relationship with Britain through the massacre of General Hicks, the defeat of General Gordon, and around this time, General Kitchener was about to embark upon the reconquest of Sudan. In January 1896, ACD's party was on a Cook paddle wheel steamer, the Nitrocross, going up the Nile. During a stop, one of these excursions that you might take, he saw firsthand the effects of a raid 2 days earlier on a village. Quote, 90 red-turbaned dervishes carrying their black banner of the Khalifa had swept through the pitiful collection of hovels and shot down half of the villagers and melted away into the desert. So he witnessed the aftermath. In his diary, he wrote, if I were the dervish general, I would undertake to carry off a Cook's excursion party with the greatest of ease. He tried to enlist with Kitchener, but to no avail. He then secured a pay-free position as a journalist for the Westminster Gazette and turned back up the Nile with a group of other journalists to cover Kitchener's progress. There was no progress. And so they returned with nothing to report. However, he got 2 stories out of it. The first was the 3 correspondents, which appeared in the book, The Green Flag. It tells of 3 reporters going up the Nile to cover Kitchener's progress, only to be attacked by a few dervishes, which they duly reported as the first skirmish. of the coming war. The second was the book, The Tragedy of Korosko, which was issued at some time under the title, A Desert Drama. It begins with a multinational party of tourists going up the Nile in a steamer, the Korosko, not unlike the Nitro Chris. Same itinerary. The novel tells of the party being carried off by a group of dervishes. There followed a series of ordeals that made a rattling good story. It reviewed well and was popular. Given that Kitchener had yet to attack, this publication was less of a historical novel and more of a foregone conclusion. Kitchener, of course, went on to a resounding victory. Whoops-a-daisy. Yeah, there we go. The book. No, I don't want that for sure. The book was expanded beyond the original Strand version. A new second chapter discussed the role of the British along the Nile with a character, a Frenchman named Fardet. And the problem with Fardet is he was unable to appreciate the high-minded British rationale. The entire chapter was propaganda for the British role as a protector of the weaker races around the world. So that's a very interesting chapter just by itself, okay? It's an entire chapter of propaganda for how the British were duty-bound to be the police of the world. The first chapter finds the boat about to stop for a shore excursion. They depart for Abu Sir Rock, which is such an extreme location that the risk of meeting the dervishes is palpable. Sure enough, the dervishes come and carry away the party after killing the young Harvard graduate Headingley. Soon, the Reverend is left for dead. Okay, in a longer version of this, I actually tell you who all the characters are, but we're not talking about this book, so we'll continue on. There follows a torturous trek across the desert on camelback. The party is never going to live to see Khartoum if they do not renounce their religion and embrace Islam and the Quran. Fardet is the most fawning, but even he stands by his religious beliefs and saves the entire party by prolonging a discussion of the roles of miracles by doing magic. Several people die at this point along the way. Good news. The book ends when they are saved by the Camel Corps. In the end, Belmont, Stevens, and Reverend were not dead. The happy ending has James Stevens and Sadie Adams, the romantic interest, romantically involved, I'm sorry. It is important that Stevens gets the girl since he epitomizes the optimistic spirit of the book. We are told in the first chapter that he was a soulless solicitor, but after a bout of influenza, he had decided that this work was trivial when compared to the wonderful, varied, and inexplicable world of which he was so ignorant. That's why he was on the boat. The crux of this book is that the members of the party, each with their own foibles and weaknesses, become stronger and more honorable under duress. It seems to be that the ordeals are crucibles for purification, fires of fate. One reading of it has that religious strength is central, inasmuch as the members of the party show their valor by affirming their faith. A careful reading shows that the people are saved by the ordeal, not by religious fealty, which is consistent with Arthur Conan Doyle's views at the time. Now we get to the fires of fate. All right. Arthur Conan Doyle's sporadic career as a playwright has often been discussed, from his early failure of Jane Annie to his various Sherlockian efforts. Waterloo has attracted much attention due to recent revivals. But other plays, such as Halves, did anybody know that he'd written a play called Halves? All right, you haven't seen it though, right? No. Halves, Brigadier Gerard, and The Fires of Fate have received less attention, possibly because they are unpublished. We will explore the latter play that was, well, anyway. The play was produced by Lewis Waller, a Spanish-born matinee idol who had previously starred in the 1906 production of Doyle's The Brigadier Gerard. That play was a moderate success, and Doyle was impressed by Waller. Fires was clearly written as a vehicle for Waller, and many of the differences in the plot are due to this. In his autobiography, Doyle says, "Some of this play is certainly the best dramatic work that I have ever done." So after a preview on June 11th, 1909 in Liverpool Shakespeare Theatre, it opened on June 15th at the Lyric Theatre in London. It ran for 125 performances here and there, transferring to the Haymarket Theatre and onward. It opened in December in Chicago and New York City. This is a nice little footnote. After a year or so, it reappeared as a podded 2-act small cast version at the Follies at the Apollo. Who knew that was the ultimate fate of plays? Now, I am going to perform the play for you. Let's watch the original production. Since you can't see the play now, so we're going to watch it. The story of the play, found in the play periodical. There's your friend. A typical hero. All right. So the first act, which is not in the book at all, has Dr. and Reverend Roden, in the doctor's office. They have a lengthy discussion about whether the philosophy of living or dying. But before they can resolve this discussion, Colonel Egerton shows up. He says he has a complaint. And they do the test. They look at a taper in his eyes, and they look at his balance and so forth. And it would be wicked to deceive you. An immediate diagnosis of death. All right, because everybody had seen this disease before. Now, the Reverend comes back, and they have a lengthy discussion. Lengthy, this is a very long act, 33 minutes long. And they talk about the fact that the Reverend says to the Colonel, "Look, your life is not your own." There's a long discussion about whether suicide is something that the Colonel should consider, because he only has a year to live. He doesn't have any relatives. He said he's going to kill himself. No, you can't do that. So instead of killing himself, he says, "Okay, I'll go on," because, you know, that's what heroes do. And they follow the Rodens to an excursion on the Nile. So Colonel joins the Rodens for a previously scheduled excursion, which leaves the next day. And here they are on the boat. That's Act 2. We meet Sadie and Miss Adams. Sadie is the young interest. These are both Americans. Sadie is, oh, well, let me go back. I love this. American Girl Collarless. She's a vacuous little girl, I have to tell you. All right, she doesn't have much to go for her. Okay, but things will change, as you guess. Miss Adams is her aunt. Then, of course, the Colonel, the dashing hero of the play, wants to pitch woo to the beautiful Sadie Adams, but he can't because he has this dreadful secret that he's going to die in 1 year. Captain Archer, a colleague of his, shows up. Now, he doesn't continue in the action, except he is a friend of the Colonel. He is Egyptian. He is in the Camel Corps. And he says, "If you need me, call me. I'm across the river." Then there is the Sidi Mohammed, a perfectly unnecessary character. His role is to be a spy to tell the dervishes that they're going off on this hike. The itinerary of the boat says they're going on the hike. They don't need to be told by a spy. But in any event, and I didn't just say that, in the play they say that too. In any event, he is this evil spy, and he does a lot of really nasty things. In fact, as he runs off, stop that man. Act 3 starts with us at the Abu Sir Rock, which is a long hike up the hill, not close at all. Very close, it's miles into the interior of the Libyan desert, which is what they call that part of the desert. They've hiked up there, they're going to sit down, have some drinks, have a good time, and go back. But no. Oh, she just about walks off the edge of a cliff, and he saves her. And what characters are everywhere. But now the dervishes come, and they start shooting. And they kill Brody. Murderers, that's the Frenchman. The colonel tries to save Sadie from these, but it doesn't work. And everybody is carried away who isn't killed. Here are some evil dervishes. Now, the colonel is smack dead, and everybody thought he's dead, but turns out he was not completely dead. He had enough strength to go up and wave to Captain Archer across the water before he collapses. Okay, so he signaled for help. Act 4. Here we have, as they used to say in high school, the nomads were sitting around the oasis eating their dates. Now, the point here is that they're at an oasis. They've gone across the desert, 2 days of horrible, horrible stuff, a real ordeal. And the captives are not very happy about being at the oasis. Okay, and in fact, the dervishes are getting tired of taking them everywhere. And so they basically say, we're going to kill most of you. And they have a confusing series of possible outs, etc. They are going to take the women because they're worth money in Khartoum, but they're not going to take the men. And they will only take the men if they claim to believe the Quran. Beauty and distress. Now the colonel reappears, left for dead. He himself walks across the desert to capture. Wasn't quite dead after all. All right, and so he shows up. He asks Sadie, "Are you glad to see me?" Because that's all he really cares about is Sadie at this point. "I can't keep it up any longer, Sadie." And then he tells her that he's going to die. So she's now in on the secret. Then there's a ordeal where, again, they're going to start killing people. And Farday, the sniveling Farday says, "Oh, no, I'll believe the Quran. Hint, hint, I don't really believe it." Well, they say that's not good. Other people say, you can't say that. It's not the noble thing to do. Either we all die or we're not. So there's a lot of group pressure at this point. And Sadie doesn't want to be taken away. And finally, yes, Captain Archer and the Camel Corps shows up at the last minute as they were about to be killed and with the women taken away. And they're saved. A new life. Why is there a new life? What's missing, and it's not a picture of it, is that the doctor discovers, conveniently the doctor's with them, the doctor discovers that the hit on the head cured him. When he got hit on the head, he was cured of sclerosis. Pretty bogus. Now, so now he can marry Sadie Adams and live happily ever after. Now, there are a lot of changes to the play, and that would be another talk of perhaps even longer than this. The trouble with talking about the changes to the play are many. One is, no one has a manuscript for the play. No one seems to have the manuscript for the play. Second, there is a typescript of the play in the British Library. There is a typescript of the play in the New York Public Library. They're not the same. I have a copy, and you can get one for yourself from the New York Public Library, and somebody's put it online. You can have a copy of the script. So you can get a copy of the script, and it's conveniently a color copy because some of these things have to be seen in color. On this, there are pages scratched out, which I am convinced was done by the director of the New York play, not Arthur Conan Doyle. So this was highly edited by the director before it was shown. And there's lots of other corrections. So, for example, oops, wrong thing. I own this, which is handwritten corrections to the play by Arthur Conan Doyle. Okay, so we have these as well, handwritten corrections. There is another set of corrections, 2 pages of corrections that Stern has for sale in Boston. He would not take $2,500 for it, so you're going to have to pay more if you want to read these. All right, so there are some corrections out there, such as these, and they're confusing because if you read these carefully, they don't correspond to either of the typescripts. Okay, there's just some other version out there. So there's several versions of this play out there, so it's very hard, almost impossible, to say what corrections were made. But I'll point out one wonderful example of a correction that's hard to understand. In the play, as shown in that periodical I told you about, it ends with this wonderful pair of lines. Sadie, dear, you said that if you escape, you would make someone happy. This is the last line of the play. The colonel turns. She has kept her word. Okay, no, because they're going to get together now. So he's going to make Colonel happy. Fair enough? Beautiful ending. Look how it ends in New York. She just says, saved, saved. And even the last 2 lines are cut off by the director. A beautiful final line. Oh, you saved me. We're going to be happy forever. Gone, just gone. All right, so it's very hard to say what version of the play you want to refer to, which is perhaps another reason it's not published, okay? However, I just want to point out to you I've done my best to tell you everything that I have access to, okay? So we'll have to leave it at that. Now, we're not done. Oh, we're just getting started. We're just getting started. Now, in my reading, that whole episode was just 1 line. All right, now we get back to the reading. The Pall Mall Gazette asked why the play was called Fires of Fate. ACD said, the characters really pass through the fires of fate and by them are cleansed and purified. They are the vices and faults of normal people, such as those found in modern civilization. He began writing the play in 1906, but did not finish till 1909. His first wife, Tui, had just died after suffering for a long time with tuberculosis in 1906. So we can easily surmise that this long suffering and leading to death is something that was on his mind when he decided to write the play, which is perhaps why he changed it from the book. Why did he decide to change this? In addition, it was because it was a vehicle for Waller. Okay, Waller had to be a matinee idol. And it is easier to change the focus to one person's journey as to a whole bunch of people's journey. Now, the play and novel both were deeply concerned with the standing true to one's own beliefs and how you would be purified by ordeal. But the play has this new example of sclerosis by retreating from the general theme of hope and optimism to the specific case of abandoning suicide. But unfortunately, that means the larger moral is diluted because it's just now focused on suicide. And if you remember those headlines I showed you earlier, the headlines were, "Play is about suicide." A contemporary review concentrated on the suicides aspect. If it is a play that boldly sets forth that a man's life is not his own to live and leaves it as it pleases him, but a thing to be lived through to the bitter end, if necessary, because though no good may come of it to you, good may come to others. Though through not committing suicide, he was instrumental in saving the lives of the friends, because he was on the boat, and earned happiness for himself. This is an excellent moral, said the reviewer. I do remind you that ACD did treat suicide in a similar manner in the Sherlock Holmes story, The Veiled Lodger. Fortunately, Arthur Conan Doyle tells us what the point of the play is, which is not something he always does. In a letter found in the Newberry Library, this letter is found in the Newberry Library, it goes as follows. I venture to think that the point is somewhat been missed by the reviewer, which I would ascribe to my own fault, were it not the fact that I met so many people last night who understood the play. You appear, the reviewer, to feel that the object of the Quran episode was to show that suffering had changed the characters of the tourists to such an extent that they would become martyrs. My object was rather to show that it had not done so. It marked their limitation, since they wanted to abjure the faith to save their lives and only shrank back from the shame by their surviving comrades. No, the point of the play is that Brown, the selfish glutton who had become more unselfish, that Sadie, who had never thought of others, meant to do so more in the future, that the doctor, sees how absurd his testiness and narrowness are and has doubts about his own materialism, the clergyman loses sight of his hot-headedness, and so on, each an example of the refining of one's character by the fires of fate. The Quran is a mere episode. The character change is the thesis of the play. I do not know that this is, quote, cannot be distinguished from a host of melodramas. It may be my ignorance of modern stage work, but I cannot recall any play that ever treated this subject at all. Excuse this intrusion, blah, blah, blah. All right. Now, so by going further, and I have few more pages of him describing his own thoughts about the play, which is, again, a rare thing for him to do. I'll just read a small bit of that. Well, the reason is that the whole action of the play is to illustrate a philosophical theory of life as laid down in the first act, which is where they talked about suicide. I suppose many plays are morality plays in the sense that the old British melodrama was one, for its essential point was that virtue would triumph and vice would be defeated. But it seemed to me that there was room for something which dealt with the more modern problems and applied more to life as we know it. So what is that philosophy? It's as old as the hills. It is the optimism that I believe to be the supreme human wisdom, and that faith which enables a man to be optimistic upon general principles, however much the particular instance may seem to be an exception to that scheme. If he works on the general principles, he will always find his faith justified in some fashion. I do not use faith in any restricted or theological sense. I mean that idea that underlies every religion, and which, as it seems to me, no skepticism can really shake. The faith is a primal cause in something beyond the chance in the universe, in a definite design which controls everything, both materialistic and spiritual. Okay? So this is very interesting for people who have this kind of narrow view of Doyle as being a-religious. Okay, he was certainly against organized religion, but he definitely still had a very strong religious aspect, disjoint from organized religion. The theological view of the play expresses views that I have strongly held all my life. I wrote a semi-theological novel called The Stark Munro Letters, containing views on optimism and fatalism. The play is an attempt to show the influence of spiritual laws on the lives of man and woman. Now, we're not done because I have to get one more example. The land of mist. The land of mist, you may have seen it on an earlier slide. You might say, why is it here? Well, in the land of mist, Professor Challenger is converted to spiritualism, and one of the proofs that leads the reluctant Challenger on this path involves multiple sclerosis, which is called disseminated sclerosis, a distinct but related neurological disease. In chapter 14, one of Challenger's rare friends, Dr. Ross Scotton, is afflicted with it and given a hopeless prognosis. Challenger says, better look facts in the face than to console oneself with fancies. But the withering doctor does clutch at a spiritualistic thread of hope, a Dr. Felkin, who is only present when channeled by the frail nurse Ursula. Since the doctor is in fact feeling better, after talking to nurse Ursula, he implores Challenger to accept the cure and the reality of the mediumship that delivered it. What was this cure? Well, clearly ACD, who had struggled with how to treat a related neurological disease, should have taken medical science's high ground here. Instead, we are given the typical mumbo jumbo of a quack. I'm not going to read all this to you, but it basically is watch what you eat, and I'll feel your spine. Oh, that's better now. My X-ray vision tells me that your spine is okay and the affliction has gone away. This is the proof that convinces Challenger. It's pretty embarrassing. This is a terrible hash of the worst aspects of chiropractic and osteopathic medicines. Further, Dr. Felkin's, okay, I've already told you this part. Okay, so the point is this, just an awful episode in the Land of Mist about sclerosis. And my final section is called Medical Integrity. Do I have a slide for that? No, that's a little bit ahead. All right. What can be said about ACD's medical acumen and integrity? This is the point of the talk. We have a long arc with spinal sclerosis as a case study. He clearly was well up on the literature with strong understanding of the state of the art of possible causes, morbidity, and treatments. His thesis was largely confined to mental experiments. However, it revealed a warm attitude to rigorous science. His short stories did not sugarcoat the prognosis for his patients. In fact, they clearly assumed the reader was familiar with syphilis, the symptoms of sclerosis, and the fatal outlook. He never presented his own hypothetical treatment to the public. With the fires of fate, all that changed. In Act 1, Colonel Egerton shows up with vague complaints, and he is told about, I'm skipping some parts here, about the straight talk, about it would be wicked to deceive you. As with James Walker in that previous short story, the prognosis is certain death following an agonizing period of disability. So far, this is the responsible way to address the public. It is curious that the play steers clear of the tension that was in the surgeon's talk, which means the implication of syphilis. There is no hint that Colonel Egerton suffers from the complications of syphilis. Why should he? He's a matinee idol. Okay, so perhaps he had hereditary syphilis. In any event, though unattached like Walker, Egerton is, quote, just the soul of honor with a heart so kind that he would not hurt a fly. It is this notion of a possible cure that is the most important feature of Fires of Fate. In the first act, Dr. Roden offers a barest hope, quote, the doctor gives a solitary example of a cure owing to the shock of a man experienced by seeing his wife killed in a railway accident. In Act 3, Egerton is amongst the party and he's brutally attacked. And during a valiant act, he is struck down. The climax of the play has Egerton realizing that he's been cured. Colonel says, you remember that railway accident? Well, Abu Sir Rock has been my railway accident. Oh, men, to think that we should ever blaspheme against life. What a rainbow-tinted land of promise it is. Now, not only is he cured, but this play allows him to pledge himself to the love interest. Now we get to the conclusions. Such a cure makes good melodrama, but was it a responsible decision for ACD to include it? Spinal sclerosis was, at the time, more common than today, so we can expect the theater-going public to be more personally interested in the hope of a cure than today. Might the public consider it a viable medical idea? Consider this early New York Times review. Quote, Dr. Doyle presumably knows his medicine, but his exposition of this case is the weakest feature of the play. We doubt Doyle acted on any anecdotal evidence. We never have been able to find any evidence that sounds like this railway accident. Okay? Even so, 24 years earlier, Doyle had a detailed knowledge of the course of the disease. It is often characterized by relapsing, remitting periods in which of course is the root of a wealth of anecdotal cures for lots of diseases. Doyle acknowledged this through the words of the Professor Challenger in a similar situation. Do not tamper with your reasoning. Such a complaint has its natural systole and diastole. The flimsy evidence would not have convinced a younger ACD. The use of such a cure as a plot device in a popular play represents, in my opinion, a lapse of medical judgment. This was at a time in his life when he had clearly left the practice of medicine behind and sacrificed prudence to the higher goals of the modern morality play. We have heard his own description of the lofty goals of the play. He never mentions the introduction of the disease into the play's plot. Dr. Rodin in the play is a doctor and is portrayed as materialistic and unable to see the value of spiritual laws over natural laws. In the Land of Mist, it gets worse. It is not clear that ACD subscribes to any of these mystical therapeutic techniques, but the whole of the novel is clearly meant to contain demonstrations that he felt would draw even the most rational opponent to the light of spiritualism. Doyle never seriously discussed quackery in any of his writings that I could find. It is recorded that he rejected Christian Scientists in 1923, quote, faith healing and the healing by what we now call suggestion are as old as history. However, it seems that he was more accepting of quackery if it was endorsed in a spiritualistic setting. If he believed even a portion of what is found in Mist, it represents a critical downturn in his medical acumen. In short, if there is a continuation of the subordination of careful medical outlooks to the service of a higher good. We see that these lapses were hinted at in 1909 and became quite serious by the Land of the Mist in 1926. Since the public knew ACD was a doctor, he should not have deceived the public. Thank you. You can ask lots of questions because a lot of stuff was on the cutting room floor for this talk. Yes?
To take the mic, if anyone has a question.
Oh, we have a mic.
I can bring it over. Okay, one second, Kathy. Karen? And again, I'm going to remind you that what you say will be on the YouTube video, but not who you are. That will be kept a secret.
Anything I say might be used against me. Okay. This is actually more a comment than a question. It makes me very happy that Doyle didn't go in this direction with the Sherlock Holmes stories, that he sort of played a trick and had this, something like a seance at the very end, and oh, I see who the guilty person is. Because you talked about religion, say in its purest sense, the idea of there being an ultimate good, and maybe that suffering helps us be stronger and come to that, and the importance of faith, because that's exactly what you have in the Sherlock Holmes stories, that Watson has this tremendous implicit faith in Holmes, that he's going to find out the truth,
right,
that justice will prevail, and Holmes does, even though it's science that he's using. So let's see, where am I going with this as far as a question is concerned?
Let me say that there are at least 3 books on Sherlock Holmes and religion. Okay.
Really?
Oh,
Okay, fine,
absolutely.
Sure, yeah, I know.
There's at
one
least
of
3
them.
books on that subject.
Yeah, maybe you
And
could
so
tell us
these
a bit about
connections
that.
of how religious Holmes was, or allowed to be, have been discussed at length. I do remind, repeat what you said earlier, is a lot of people were happy that Sherlock Holmes was not condemned to become someone who believes in spiritualism. Apparently, Professor Challenger could be expended to this goal, but Doyle did very much. Excuse me. There's no hint that Doyle ever wanted to change Sherlock Holmes to feel this way. But to what extent Sherlock Holmes was spiritual and so forth has been discussed in these books.
This isn't so much a question as just a comment on the illustrations. I noticed they left the colonel for dead, say he's dead, and yet the illustrations show his head is bandaged. Why would they bandage the head of a corpse?
I'm sorry?
Well, I noticed in the illustrations they left him say he's dead, but then they find out later he's alive and he's signaled and everything else. But it shows him with a bandage on his head. Why did they bandage the head of somebody they thought was dead?
When they left the scene, he was dead on the ground. He got up, bandaged his own head, and signaled. There's no hint that anybody else did that.
Quick
Sorry.
addition to that with the illustrations. Do you know who did the illustrations?
Those
Those ones that you just saw?
they were in that playbook.
Right, but who
Okay.
was the illustrator?
That was from the original cast at the Lyric Theater.
Oh, those were photographs.
Those are photographs
Oh,
at the Lyric Theater cast. All of those photographs were also released as postcards, which I have. I didn't think anybody would like to see me hold postcards up, but all of those were translated into postcards.
I'm just wondering what the ratio is. My cousin, male, he had started contacting MS when he was 32, and the slow progression, because he had the progressive MS, and he ultimately died at age 78, where he was in a high-powered wheelchair, and he could only speak. He couldn't move from the neck down. That was it.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering, what is the percentage in population and how it affects? And are there different statistics for males and females? Because I also learned from my cousin that females are more susceptible to MS than males.
Let me say that I didn't prepare for an answer for this, but I can tell you because my wife has MS and I go to all the MS meetings. Men have it less. And if men get it at a certain age, it usually is more virulent than women. So it's a mixed bag. Okay. And depends on when they got it, how long the course would be, because the new medicines are extraordinarily good at slowing the progress. Theoretically, everybody's going to die from it, but you may die from something else before the MS gets you because these slow down the progress of the disease. And so this particular person, I do not know when they got it and what drugs they were taking, because the drugs get better every year. So it's every person has their own story. There is no typical course of MS. Okay, I do want to remind you that the tabes dorsalis is not MS. Okay, it's for whatever reason affects a certain part of the spine that MS doesn't affect. All right, so it's in an autopsy, it looks different. Okay, but they are both lesions that attack the myelinization of the nerve cells. All of those things are the same. But the quick death sentence is something that was true for all of these diseases at the time. Okay, the only reason we don't hear about it today is that no one gets the disease anymore because no one gets syphilis anymore.
Thanks, Dana. I was intrigued by the fact that both in the play and in another short story that he has these sort of miracle cures. And being a physician who probably had quite a bit of experience with what seem to be spontaneous recoveries that aren't consistent with a particular disease, that he would have known that maybe the original diagnosis was the reason for the cure, as opposed, like, in other words, the patient never had the problem in the first place.
That's very true. And as I hinted, there were so many types of related diseases that had the same symptoms, but not the same, because they couldn't tell the difference until they did an autopsy. A lot of people did survive. In fact, that was how they diagnosed them as not having tabes dorsalis, as they didn't die. Okay, and so it's sort of backhanded, but yes, it's all true.
I was wondering if you could comment on the standards of writing a thesis at this time, because I understand these days you need a lot of original work. And for any candidate to do a summary of other writings, to me, would that be a standard of the time, or is it because it's a lesser known subject matter than perhaps other subjects? And at what level was the thesis? Was it master's or PhD?
It was doctorate.
Doctorate, yeah.
Okay, as for his MD. Now, he already had an MB and medical bachelor's, for which you do also have to do some scholarly work. And he was also a surgeon, but this takes him to the next higher level, where you're no longer called doctor anymore. You're really, in any event, the titles of medical people in England is something I've never quite understood. But regardless to your point was this a embarrassingly simple thesis that would not have risen to that level? The answer is, it was medical. The criteria for a medical thesis then and now are different than for, let's say, a chemistry thesis or so forth. Okay, where in chemistry you have to have something wholly new, et cetera, et cetera. Medical thesis was just more. He did have to have a thesis, of course. His thesis was that a vasodilator would be a thing to work with. So if he didn't have that, he would not have had a thesis. He did have a medical thesis, okay, that it was a vasospasm thing and that and this would be a cure. He admitted in the thesis as outrightly as he could, he didn't have a lab, he didn't do any autopsies, he didn't do anything else. So the apologetic nature of those remarks indicates that other people's theses at the same level might have included autopsies. Okay, and so he was an outlier. Why was he allowed to be an outlier? Because he was already working in the real world. He had left the university 10 years earlier. He was no longer at a university. This was just a next step in his medical training, so to speak. But he was no longer in any university setting, and that's perhaps the biggest reason it was allowed to go through.
In view of the lack of manuscripts and the differences between the typescripts and the notes that you've got of variations and corrections, how does this affect the auction value of the paperwork? Increase it or decrease it because of the contradictions?
A typescript of the play sold at auction in 2006, sold, and Stern bought it, and Stern turned around and sold it to somebody, and he will not tell us who he sold it to. Okay, so one typescript is in private hands right now. The other typescript is in the New York Public Library, but that seems to be a working script from a director. I have not been able to get a copy of the one at the British Library, but we do know that it is substantially different than the one at the New York Library. So it doesn't alter the value. If your question is about the value, any one of these would be very valuable. The only thing that would be extraordinarily valuable would be a handwritten version of the play, which no one seems to think exists anymore.
Dana, I'm a little bit, well, I'm confused about a lot of this. But
No, no, no.
It's-
We'll
it's-
stay here till
it's-
you get it all.
No, this is very complicated. But I would, this fellow, Edgerton, who had the sclerosis,
Yes.
was it assumed that he had that through syphilis?
I would think most of the people going to the play would have assumed that. All right? But there was no line in the play like there was in the story, like he was unmarried and had several women friends. There was no line like that, which was the sort of code for saying he had syphilis. Since there was no such line, it is possible somebody attending the play would not have come to that conclusion. They would only have come to the conclusion if they realized that the spinal sclerosis is linked to syphilis, is linked to blah blah. So it's entirely possible. And I don't know what percentage of the people watching the play would have known that. I would think maybe 30 or 40% probably assumed he had syphilis, and perhaps the rest didn't, because there was no language in there cueing that.
If it had been a woman who had contracted this disease because of syphilis, presumably there would have been a terrible disparagement toward her, and she wouldn't have been a heroine. She would have been condemned.
I want to tell you that I read about 40 contemporary accounts of this. Not a single mention of a woman. You won't be surprised. Only time they were mentioned is in doing counts. How many women got this, how many women got that, and so forth. They are mentioned in that context, but no case studies involving women comes up. Again, I know you won't be surprised when I say that. Yeah. All right. But yes, I'm sure it was a scourge on their reputation. But again, you could get it from your husband.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's definitely the case. Definitely, yes.
You mentioned handwritten play quite often. What's the alternative at the time? Did most writers write by hand, or what?
Well, Doyle has lots of handwritten manuscripts out there. It's only later in life that he went to the point of immediately giving his manuscripts to his secretary, who would type them up. So there was a point in time, I don't know the exact year, after which most things went to the publisher as typed documents. But he would write them himself by hand. He didn't type anything. But the handwritten manuscripts never left the house and may have been thrown away once they were typed up. But previous to that time, the handwritten manuscripts went to the publisher, and they had a really good chance of surviving. Yes.
That's correct, but just to point out, the Parish magazine, the one that I didn't want to really bring to the library, but I did, because the library owned it, that was written in 1930, and it's a handwritten manuscript.
Right.
I think his sister typed.
It's possible. Like I said, I think he handwrote every one of his manuscripts,
Yes.
but they may not have left the house, as I said, because a lot of them were typed before they were sent to a publisher. After a certain point in time, I don't know the year, like 1895, let's say.
It was probably a few years after that.
Okay. He did have a secretary, and he did do those sorts of duties. And of course, in addition to the handwritten manuscripts, there's thousands of handwritten letters out there too. So there's a lot of holographic Doyle to be collected. Yes?
I'm going to thank you.
Oh,
You deserve a thank you, Dana. Hey.
didn't it insult you in any way?
No,
No. Her and I don't agree on everything, and so sometimes I have to watch out for it.
That's okay. Well, just when we thought we'd covered every possible subject related to Arthur Conan Doyle, along comes Professor Dana Richards with a topic that few of us have ever contemplated, melding his literary and dramatic talents with his medical expertise in ways only he could have envisioned. Who knew that ACD's interest in sclerosis would lead to an entire morality play? And what a connection, however circuitous and convoluted, judging by that letter that you quoted, Dana. Nor did I ever anticipate attending a lecture about Arthur Conan Doyle and syphilis. Although I don't know why I should be surprised. I mean, somehow we can connect Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes with just about every subject imaginable, which makes him so appealing as a writer. But being a computer scientist, Dana has an abiding fascination for Conan Doyle, the scientist, and his excellent article on the subject, in case you haven't caught it, has just appeared in the latest issue of Canadian Holmes, so I recommend that to you. Yeah, there it is. And I'd like to add on a personal note that we're really sorry that Dana's wife, Nelda, who inspired today's talk, apparently, couldn't be here today. She's a lovely woman. So Dana, please send her our greetings from Toronto. And could we have had under discussion a more appropriate subject, the abduction of a group of people by Middle Eastern terrorists? I don't know. You didn't. I'm just going to say that. That's all I'm going to go there. But that again goes to show how relevant Conan Doyle has remained a century after his passing, reaching far beyond Sherlock Holmes. There are just no limits to the ways in which ACD and his world may be studied and interpreted. Dana, thank you so much for coming to Toronto, for shedding light on this fascinating, if unlikely subject. It's been a revealing and eye-opening afternoon. Thank you.